Mesdames et messieurs, 3 mots en français pour vous souhaiter la bienvenue, la plus cordiale bienvenue à cette conférence Pierre Dubois 2015, qui nous donne l'occasion d'entendre quelqu'un que plusieurs d'entre nous connaissent bien. Et pour le présenter et pour dire plus précisément ce que cette fondation fait et en quoi elle est liée à l'Institut, j'aimerais donner la parole d'abord à Philippe Pidou, président de la Fondation Pierre Dubois.
Dear Mr. Krastev, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, I would like to welcome you all to the Pierre Dubois annual lecture organized by the Graduate Institute in partnership with the Fondation Pierre Dubois pour l'Histoire du Temps Présent. It's a great privilege, honor and pleasure for us to welcome Ivan Krastev. His talk today is entitled The Imitation Game, Russia and the West, a very topical subject. Ivan Krastev is a renowned political scientist, chairman of the Center for Liberal Strategies in Sofia, permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, and founding board member of the European Council on Foreign Relations. He has published intensively, and France Culture recently called him, quote, one of Europe's most brilliant intellectuals today. Well. The foundation carries the name of a very old friend of mine, Pierre Dubois, who was professor of international history and politics at the Graduate Institute for the last 15 years of his life. He left us prematurely, to our immense sadness, more than 8 years ago. He was 64. The foundation was created in accordance with his wishes and aims to promote and support research on current history. We work in close collaboration and in partnership with the Graduate Institute and have developed a whole array of activities such as this annual lecture which bring us today. Thank you very much, Ivan Krastev, for coming to Geneva. I give you the floor.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you very much for you being here. If I was as good as the introduction, it was going to be good, but you know, the introductions are always much better than the speaker. This is why the speakers like to be introduced. Also, for me, this is really a kind of something special, because these memorial lectures are very different than the lectures which you normally are giving, either as a university professor or in some policy conferences, because there is a person whom you don't know, which is behind it. And you can imagine that basically this person could be here, and you don't want to disappoint him. And we're talking about a scholar, and the scholar that has been very much interested in the Cold War. So what is the other kind of advantage of this type of lectures is that you have the right to be brief. I'll try to speak for 30, not more than 35 minutes, so we're going to have time for questions and conversation. But also it allows you to come with certain ideas that you're still cooking. Because normally, basically, on academic conferences, you want to be on the safe side. And here, I'll try to risk and basically present to you much more the skeleton of an argument, because I'm also very much interested, basically, to your response. So when it comes to Russia, in the last 2 years, there is one word that basically summarizes the Western experiences, at least if you're basically reading the papers. We are constantly surprised. We have been surprised by Crimea. We have been surprised by the decision of the Russian government military to intervene in Syria. Too much of a surprise. And the basic story is, if we're so much surprised, obviously, there is a kind of a failure to understand the strategic logic of the Russian foreign policy. It's not that we are lacking explanations, But I do believe that in the last 2 years there was quite a lot of moralizing and not very much a kind of understanding that is going to allow us to try to see when we're going to be surprised the next time. So this is why basically I decided to very much focus my presentation today on something that before 30 years ago is going to be called the sources of the Russian strategic behavior. It's not going to be a reflection on a classical geopolitical stuff. You're going to see that in a certain way. I'll try to come with a different approach. But this is quite important because today when people are discussing Russia's behavior, it's very much reduced to basically reading President Putin's mind. If you see the most popular books about Russia these days are biographies of President Putin. The problem is that when in 1947, George Kennan wrote the famous long telegram, which was probably the most important analytical text of the Cold War, the name of Soviet leader Stalin was mentioned twice. And this was not because Stalin was unimportant. It was 1947. You have the feeling that basically he controls power in Moscow as nobody before. But why it was possible for Kennan to talk about the sources of Soviet strategic behavior without basically becoming the personal coach or psychoanalyst of Stalin, and why we basically took a totally different approach. And I do believe part of this is very much rooted in the fact that we still don't know how to think about post-Cold War Russia. I will start with a quote or metaphor which comes a century ago. The American judge, Oliver Holmes, said that in the relations between two persons, there are always 6 actors. First, this is the images of these 2 persons about themselves. Secondly, they're the images of each other. And then they're how the God sees them. In our case, of course, we didn't manage to interview the God for the way how sees European Union, United States, or Russia in this relationship. But I do believe that one of the interesting questions and basically the major argument of my presentation tonight is going to be that the biggest failure of the Western analytical community to get sense of the Russian strategic behavior is not based so much in the way that we don't know enough about Russian history or to know basically about certain economic and other constraints that Russia is facing. The biggest failure to understand how the Russians see us. And this is what basically makes us being constantly surprised. This also, there were different reasons that basically push you to try to frame the question in one way or the other, but there are 2 kinds of personal experiences that makes me very much to try to ask the question this way and not basically trying to see the normal question of how we see Russia. The first was years ago, 2009. I had a conversation with the previous head of the Putin's presidential administration, Mr. Voloshin, who said something which I remembered. He said, listen, we know you better than you know us because we always wanted to live like you. When he said you, he didn't mean Bulgarians, by the way. But basically he said, as a result of it, we Russians have been interested in anything in the West. How you eat, how you drink, what do you watch, how you shave yourselves. Why you have not been very much interested, because especially after the end of the Soviet Union, your own interest was when we're going to become like you. And there is a truth in this. In a certain way, it was Carl Schmitt who noticed this in the 1950s, that victorious powers, as a rule, lost curiosity. The second very strong impression that came to me was talking to a senior Russian politicians, especially after Crimea. There was coming this very strong sense and accusations about the hypocrisy of the West. They're going to talk really with incredible passion about what we did wrong with Kosovo, what we did wrong with Libya, what we did wrong with Iraq, and 80% of what they have been saying was true. When they said, you didn't tell us in Libya that you're about regime change, but it's not simply that you have been about regime change, but also see what happened after this. But then comes this 20% that always puzzled me. And this was the sentence, but this is what you wanted. the idea of instability and destabilization of others being the major rationale of the Western and especially American foreign policy in the post-Cold War period and especially after 9/11 is something that is very strongly in the way basically the Russian leadership sees the world. And then I decided that if you want to try to understand how they see us and basically how their system work, we should try to ask very simple questions, but questions that try to make things that look otherwise trivial and neglected important. And there are two questions that I am going to present to you and try to answer in front of you. And these questions I find very important for understanding both Russian domestic and foreign policy. But on the first reading, probably they're going to look surprising for you. The first question is, why did President Putin rig elections which otherwise he's going to win if they had been free and fair? And the second question is, why does he lie that there were no Russian special forces in Crimea, knowing perfectly well that this type of a statement cannot survive for more than 2 hours? So I'll start with the first one, because I do believe the first one is going to give something about understanding of power and domestic politics and regime, and the second basically will try to come with something that I find quite important when it comes to the Russian foreign policy objectives, not in one or another crisis, but basically how they see the world and the international system. Every one of you that have been reading the history of the Cold War know how important the show trials of the 1930s have been for the way the perception of the Soviet regime was shaped. Everybody of the people who have been living then and were trying to make sense of the Soviet system was shocked. They cannot understand why on the eve of the war, and everybody had the feeling that the war is coming, Stalin decided basically to execute and to destroy the elite of the Soviet army, legendary Bolsheviks and others, why they confessed on all these trials. And certainly why the trial? Such a bourgeois institution, why the new Soviet state basically decided to organize everything through trials? I'm saying this because I do believe that in the way it's very difficult to understand the internal logic of the Stalin regime without understanding the logic of the show trials, it is going to be very difficult to understand the internal logic of the Russian regime today if you're not going to understand the role which the elections are playing. Elections are important for Putin's Russia. In a certain way, paradoxically and contrary to the common sense, the elections are the major source of legitimacy. But it's a particular type of elections. It's a rigged elections which nobody is going to protest. I'm saying this because many people, and the normal explanation of why Russia is holding election is that they're doing this because of us. They try to impress the West. They're doing this because they will try to look democratic. But listen, especially in the last years, it's quite obvious that impressing the West, especially positively impressing the West, is not the major objective of the Russian foreign policy. So why they're doing this and why they're so important, why they're organized? If you're going to see the budgets, if somebody comes from Mars and try to understand what is happening in our country without knowing anything, but just seeing the figures, for example, of the budgets, he's going to be absolutely convinced that Russia is a classical democracy because in the pre-election years the budgets go up. So why basically people come and try to make this effort? One story to believe that elections are unimportant for sure was to believe that President Putin himself had a very strong distaste for elections. He has said this in his own book published, Conversation with him in 2001, because his experience with the elections is very bitter. It's 1996. He was running the elections for the then mayor of St. Petersburg, Mr. Sobchak, and these were really dirty elections. So from this point of view, you can start with the fact that the elections in Russia are not free and fair because simply President Putin does not believe that they are free and fair elections. Because his own experience does not basically giving him any arguments why these free and fair elections exist. And don't forget that even when it comes to the elections in the West, one of the major sources which have been shaping this type of a generation's idea of democracy have been the books that you're reading in your youth, and the major story of the Soviet understanding of the democratic political system in the West, that it was a very kind of a perverse form of a class power. And if you're going to listen to many of the people that have been protesting on the streets of Europe, they're going to tell you the same. It's a facade. The freedom of speech basically go only for the people who can publish newspapers, not for the people who can read them. I'm saying this because if this was true, there's come the second question. If the President Putin and the Russian government, I'm using now Putin, not reading his mind, but much more metaphorically, if he does not believe in elections, but wants to simply to manipulate the elections, why he's doing in the way that everybody knows that elections are manipulated? These are not the elections in which the governments try to cover their very strong intervention in the political process. It's just the opposite. It's done in a very demonstrative way. You're not going to register certain parties. They're going to be a leaking of information saying that there was a pressure here and there. Why, if you decided to manipulate elections, you want to make the manipulations so obvious, so evident? What is the political logic of this? And here I'm going to claim that the elections are extremely important for the current Russian regime because they perform 5 very important functions. This is through elections first, that Russian leaders convince the population that there is no alternative to the current leadership and to the President Putin. Because the Russian elections, like every elections, and this is very important for the democratic politics, elections, and Tocqueville already noticed this in the 19th century, are a very strange combination of dramatization and trivialization. On the day before the elections, politicians are telling you that the world is going to disappear, that everything is going to collapse, that never the situation was so bad. The day after they elected, they said, but now it's basically business as usual. So you have this dramatization and trivialization, which are creating a cycles in which people are very strongly worried at one level, and then basically you have this calming down and you have the feeling that everything is under control. In the case of Russia, the elections are the way first to demonstrate the popularity of the president, but also to tell people, look around, who else can govern? Is it going to be Mr. Zyuganov or Mr. Zhirinovsky? It's not by accident that they're almost always the same people that have been confronting President Putin for the last 16 years. And to be honest, if I should vote, and Mr. Putin is on one side, and on the other is Mr. Zhirinovsky or Mr. Zyuganov, this no alternative policy is of extreme importance for the very kind of justification of the regime. This allows to the people to support the regime even when they see its total inefficiency, because what mobilizes people is not discontent, but the sense of alternative. If you don't have a sense that there is an alternative to the way you are living, nevertheless how discontented you are, the best thing that you should do is to leave the country and not basically to do anything political. But there are 4 other important functions of this type of rigged elections. The second is that elections allows the president very much to control the middle level of governments. It performs the same role the military exercises perform for the military. Because what is happening on the election day, and this is very important, Russian government does not tolerate stuffing the ballots. The manipulation of the elections is much more pressing the people to go and to vote the right way. But in order to get people to vote the right way, you should have certain leverage over these people. So after the presidential elections, you know that they are not going to elect who is going to be the new president, but you know that some governors are going to lose their positions because they have failed to demonstrate that they are controlling the situation in their regions. They cannot bring people to the ballot boxes. And this form of control is extremely important because this is one of the problems of the authoritarian regimes, that you do not have a real-life test how the system works, because there is a very strong incentive for all levels to give wrong information that is going to present by the people who are governing in a light which is better for them. The third important role and function of the rigged elections is that through the rigged elections is when you define who is loyal opposition and who is disloyal opposition. This is not how much you're going to get on the elections. The biggest question is who is going to be allowed to compete. 4 years ago, Mr. Navalny was allowed to run for the mayor of Moscow. on the last elections, his party was not registered anywhere. So the problem of loyalty is not loyalty to the public, but it's much more loyalty to the government. And this is where this loyalty test is surpassed. If you're allowed to run on the elections, you're perceived as unacceptable. You're systemic opposition. If you're cut and you're not allowed to run, you're anti-systemic opposition. The fourth and one of the very symbolically important part of the elections is the following. You know very much how the post-Soviet Russia came into being. It was a major catastrophe. Certain country disappeared. The idea and the fear of disintegration is very much part of the personal experience of almost everybody that have been living there. And as you know, Russia is not a homogeneous society. There are certain parts of the countries culturally more different than others. And then comes the election night. And on the election night, you start to see the results coming from different parts of the country. And this is the celebration of the unity of the country. It's better than military parades. You see Chechnya voting 98% for the president. This feeling that you have the unity of the country controlled is extremely important when you have a society very much shaped by insecurity and fear of disintegration. But the fifth and the most important function of the elections is that basically it's not about imitation democracy, it's about imitation authoritarianism. Through organizing elections that are openly rigged, but nobody protesting, basically the president is sending the message, I have a total control. Nobody is going to oppose me. So this makes not necessary for him to go with any type of an openly repressive policy, because repression is not a low-cost operation. Repressing a huge amounts of people is not an easy exercise. So from this point of view, it's a very strong prevention type of a policy because you demonstrate the extent to which you control everything. This is why the protests of Moscow in 2012 was so important. Not because they have any chance to change the president or to change the political system, but for the first time, the elections has been contested. So this type of a source of legitimacy have become problematic. I'm saying this because one of the major and the most important rationale for organizing a regime like this is that you're not about simply trying to preserve your power, which is obviously here, but it is very much to demonstrate the strengths that you don't have. For the whole 1990s, Russia was very much preoccupied with the idea of its own weakness. And how to demonstrate strengths has become one of the major rationale for the Russian political leaders. Looking strong was extremely important because, as President Putin said in 2004, what I have learned, the weak are beaten. I'm saying this because I'll go to my second question. Why did the Russian president declared that there were not Russian special forces in Crimea? This was a big surprise. I'm just going to quote you something. So in March 2014, when it happened, the United States government was outraged to the point of the poetic inspiration. So here I'm reading from their release. They said, as Russia spins a false narrative to justify its illegal action in Ukraine, the world has not seen such a startling Russian fiction since Dostoevsky wrote, the formula 2 + 2 = 5 is not without attractions. This is quite important because there is a lot of studies, and the best of them, I do believe, is John Schmerheimer's book on why leaders lie, how deception and lie functioned in international politics. And Mersheimer, who is the dean of the realists and so on, he made three, in my view, very important arguments to understand what is specific about this claim. First, he said, states lie to each other much less than people expect. Because basically the rationale of lying between states is not so great because you also risk quite a lot, and this type of signaling is not so popular as people expect. Secondly, he said, strangely enough, the democratic governments tend to lie much more than the authoritarian governments because predominantly they lie to their own population. Because normally in foreign policy there are certain issues that governments see as very important, but the population does not see like this. And because it's a democratic regime, you need the support of the population. So as a result of it, you're trying to create a situation in order to convince the people that this type of foreign policy issues are very much important. And this could be legitimate or illegitimate, but this is part of basically the internal democratic dynamic in which you cannot go in a kind of an important action if the majority of the public is not on your side. But thirdly, he said, and of course, the governments never lie when they know that their lie is going to be easily exposed. So here is the major difference between different claims. For example, Russian government is very strongly claiming that they're sure that neither Russia nor the separatists that they back has anything to do with the basically destruction of the MH17 plane. It will never going to be 100% sure how it was. They're going to be 95%, and there are going to be different experts, and I do believe that there are going to be expert consensus on certain things, but there's always going to be a doubt that probably there are 5% that it was not like this. The same with the doping scandal that probably you have read now. There are always 5 or 10%. This is not like this with the presence of 1,000 special forces, which in the age in which we are living basically are photoed very easily, and in 2 hours you know, and basically you even know their names and from which type of military units they're coming. What is even more important, President Putin didn't lie to his own population. 5 days after he claimed that there were not special forces there, he gave medal to the same forces that were not there. And this was done on television. But what is even more important, he didn't simply make a statement that was basically a lie, but he said this personally and directly to the President of the United States, to the Chancellor of Germany, to the Foreign Minister of Germany, and to a certain extent, part of the major tensions in the Russian-German relations came from this conversation. Somebody who was basically present in these talks, he said that the German foreign minister at some point said, but Mr. President, you should decide who you are, a president of a great power or middle-level intelligence officer. I'm saying this because the only reason and logic to lie about the non-presence of a Russian special forces in Crimea is that you expect to be called a liar. And I do believe this was the case. President Putin wanted to be called a liar so he can answer, liar like you. How my lie was different than, for example, General Colin Powell's lie about Iraq and having the nuclear weapons. The idea of discrediting the system does not come by offering any alternative, but basically saying, I am not breaking the rules. I am playing according to your rules. And I do believe this is extremely important if you start to believe that the major accusation in the lex of the alternative is basically this type of accusation of hypocrisy. And I do believe this is quite important because this also tries to give a much more, in my view, subtle meaning to the definition of Russia as a spoiling power. Because normally, spoiler is used these days basically much more to try to say that this is something that you don't like. But in what kind is it a spoiler? Is it simply because they want to hurt the United States, which is true? Or are they a spoiler also in the way that you have these movie spoilers? You know them? There is, for example, TV series, and then they're telling you what is going to happen in the next movies. They're telling you basically, and in the next 10 episodes, expect this and this, and it's quite a spoiler because basically they're taking the plot out of it. I'm saying this because the spoiler power, unlike the revolutionary power which tried to change the system, unlike the revisionist power which basically much more tries to change its place in the system but does not necessarily want to change the system, the spoiler power does not have neither the ideology of the revolutionary power, nor, to be honest, the potential and the capacity. Russia is not a rising power. Of the revisionist power, the position of the spoiler is much more pedagogical position. You're doing things in order to teach others a lesson. I'm going to do to you what I do believe you're doing to me in order to understand how do I feel. And I do believe this is quite important, and this is where I'm going to summarize, and basically you're going to understand why it is called imitation games. Because in a certain way, one of the most important things to understand is that while people are talking that now Russia is very much going its own way, that basically Russia is not interested in the West anymore, that Russia goes for China, that Russia goes back to the Russian tradition, when people start talking about the hybrid war and they said it's either the Cold War type of a legacy or they invented something new, this, by the way, interesting, 19th century minded power which basically invented the 21st century war. I do believe that part of the Russian policy can be best explained as a reverse engineering. They have the feeling, to be honest, I don't believe very much right what we are doing, and they are trying to reconstruct and try to imitate what they do believe we are doing. It's very much mirroring. You can be seen, if you're going to read text by text, I didn't want to bring it because it was going to be very much time consuming, but the speech which President Putin did about the annexation of Crimea and compare it to the position of the European Union on the independence of Kosovo, you can see borrowing phrases. He was using the language, the arguments, minority rights, and so on, to justify the position. Because the basic strategy is you are delegitimizing the existing international order by imitating it. And you're imitating to show that this time you're imitating the real West. Not the West that is talking, but the West that is acting. And I do believe this is quite important because in this way, in the last 25 years, you can tell the story of Russia as 3 different modes of imitating the West. In the early 1990s, it was very much imitating the West with the idea basically to become like the West, which didn't work for very long because also it didn't deliver. But if you see, basically, this was the imitation of language, but it was the imitation of institutions, of practices. To a certain extent, during the Yeltsin period, the very legitimacy of the new Russian political system was based in the way it is going to be seen by the West. Why, basically, President Yeltsin didn't see as a problem the fact that he shoot it against the parliament in 1993, because basically the West said, listen, you had the right to do it. You have been defending the political system. The second form of imitation is imitation as basically you're imitating certain practices, certain language in order to preserve status quo and to have basically have a game of its own. This is basically what I was trying to describe to you about the elections. You're not imitating Western elections to impress the West, but you find in the imitating the practices, the language of the Western political system, the way to establish and to function a regime of your own. The third form of imitation is the imitation as the way of delegitimizing the same model that you're trying to imitate. And basically trying to make the message of, so now I'm imitating the real West, not the West that basically I'm hearing from the conferences, but the West that I see. To what extent this type of imitation is fair? I do believe that to a certain extent the very traumatic experience through which Russia went pushed Russia to basically seize things that in many cases simply does not exist. But my last point is going to be one of the biggest problems which we are going to, and when I see we, I mean as an academic community, as a political community, both in the United States and Europe, is that we should try to force us to see ourselves and our actions through the eyes of the others. Not because they're right. Neither Europeans nor Americans wanted instability in Libya. I do believe this was simply policy that failed. It was probably not well prepared. Probably it was a wrong policy, but it was not about destabilization. But when you have, and this is going to be, now I'm giving the case of Russia, but you're going, probably somebody can give a very similar lecture on China or India or others based on their own experience, their own insecurity, their own internal political history. Others are going to imitate what they do believe that we are. And from time to time, it can resemble the way that you come with a coffee machine. Basically, they're trying to reassemble it, and it end up as a Molotov cocktail. But we should know that at the end of the day, it was a reverse engineering. So this was the imitation games that I was trying to present to you. Thank you very much.
So we have a bit of time for questions from the floor. Who wants to start? Here. Maybe we take 2 or 3 questions. There's one here. Yes, please.
Mr. Krastev, first of all, thank you very much for...
Sorry, could you present yourself?
Yes, my name is Max Bunkley Jarrett. I'm born in Liberia, brought up in the UK. I work here with Mr. Kofi Annan at the Africa Progress Panel. I want to first of all thank you for your lecture. Excellent. I'm a layman to this, but I'm a student of history, global history. And exactly in a more simplistic way, I had a conversation earlier this week with someone who was a former advisor to the former British Prime Minister, Tony Blair, who started going off about Putin and Syria and this and that. And I basically said to him, like what you said. And what I think part of the problem is like the question I'm posing to you is that in countries such as our countries in Africa, in China, in Russia, there is a longue durée, both forward-going and backward-going, in terms of how they see themselves in the world and in their relationships with the so-called West. What we've seen in the last 25, 30 years since the post-Cold War victory is that the memories have been forgotten about what actually that struggle, that difference is. And because there's a kind of imperial hubris, even within the foreign services of many of these countries, where they just think our way is the way, what we say goes, how we act doesn't matter. But it does matter. So in order to go forward, what would your advice be to people in the FCO in Britain, to the US State Department, to the French Foreign Ministry, how they deal with countries such as Russia, based on what you're saying? Because your approach seems to be the right way to look at things.
Thank you. My name is Ilya Nazarov. I'm from the Geneva Academy of IHL and Human Rights. Thank you for a very, very interesting talk. I certainly agree with your hypothesis that Russia, in some of its actions, is trying to imitate the West, particularly when it comes to self-determination in Kosovo and Crimea. But at the same time, I'm researching transitional justice in the post-Soviet space in Russia, and one of my arguments is that most of the let's say, persecutions of minorities in Russia and human rights violations are taking place because Russia failed to reconcile with its Soviet past. And in fact, to me, a lot of its actions, it resorts to many of the actions of the Soviet government and the Soviet regime. So how much do you think is the failure to overcome the Soviet past is attributable to the way that Russia is behaving? Thank you.
It's much easier. And thank you for both questions, because to be honest, both of them are very central to my argument. One of my arguments is that the West was seeing the world as a post-communist. And we can basically discuss with Fukuyama. People like to try to ridicule his argument, but he captured the moment. He was making, and by the way, his argument is not as kind of a blunt and naive as people believe. Basically, he said something that even now is true. There is no clear defined alternative to the market democracies. You can have different variations. You have here, you have there, but at the end of the day, it's not a Cold War environment in which you have two systems and everyone basically pretends that the future belongs to it. The problem was that Cold War managed to freeze the decolonization process. As a result of it, all this type of a post-colonial, which was very much studying here and there, was very much dominated by the Cold War discourse, because nevertheless, how and what was the history of your independent state, you should take sides during the Cold War. Basically, you should go either this way or that way. And even if you stay in the middle, this is taking sides. So from this point of view, the idea that what happened with the end of the Cold War was also unfreezing climate change when it comes to the decolonization was something that we missed, especially in Europe. Because for us, European Union and the European project, especially for the former colonial powers, was the way not to talk. about their colonial past because it was a different project. It was about Europe. It was, especially after 1970s, it was different. It was about different countries now. It was not about former imperial empires. And this is why it was so difficult to understand this type of sensitivities. And by the way, this explains why, after Russia bluntly violated international law by occupying the territory of another country, we can have explanations, we can say what we want, and by the way, probably the population of Crimea could have been voted in the way they voted, but the truth is that by force, in several days, you are not simply declaring this place independent, but you take part of a neighboring country. So this is something that is factual. This is not something to be discussed. Why countries like India, China, which does not like this type of a territorial, why they didn't react? And I do believe it was exactly because of this type of a post-colonial, not the post-communist understanding of what happened after the Cold War. And here comes the story with, in what sense it is a post-Soviet space. Listen, even the story of faking authoritarianism that I'm telling you was very much based on the fact that the Soviet memories are there. You don't need to arrest everybody. You're arresting Khodorkovsky and everybody remembers. Because the major message is, you know how it could be? And people know. And people know. And from this point of view, this is the most important about the post-Soviet as a resource. Because from the ideological point of view, what the current Russian government managed is incredible. They've succeeded to become both the successors of Imperial Russia and of the Soviet Union. To what extent, it's amazing. For example, if you're going to see, at the moment, Russia is the most anti-revolutionary power in the world. Basically, the major message of the Russian government these days is, if you see people on the street protesting against the government, don't ask what's on the street and don't ask about the government. In general, the government is right. Which is very different than the Soviet period. But this type of a mixture between the conservatism of a pre-revolutionary regime and this type of a kind of entitlement to be a great power, which came with the Soviet Union as a superpower, is very much there. And here I want to make one point, which was the critical crisis in which the divergence in the world perceptions between Russia and the West took place. It was Yugoslavia crisis. Because in the Yugoslavia crisis, it's also factually true, by the way. In the way where basically the bombing of Kosovo started, 32% of the Russian public changed their view of the West from positive to negative. But it's much more deeper than this. During the Yugoslavia crisis, and this is especially true for Europe, for the Europeans, this was basically the war against nationalism. Basically, this type of a pre-war tradition against which the European Union was basically built. The idea of the Balkanization as a very much alternative to the Europeanization, which was moving the public opinions, and this is why it was a very kind of a popular intervention when it comes to Kosovo. For the Russians, it was about territorial integrity. So then they identified with the Serbs, not simply because the Serbs were Slavs or because Milosevic was a communist, but because they started fearing that this is the future of Russia itself. If for the West the basic problem was about the dignity of the citizen, for the Russia at this moment it was about the dignity of the state. If for the West it was very much about human rights and basically what are the constraints of sovereignty, for the Russians it was very much full sovereignty. And I do believe that because then Russia was too weak politically and not consolidated to make the point, but this was the turning point in which this type of a new worldview that came back in the last years have been very much shaped. And this is why they're coming back to Kosovo, not simply of the precedent, but because this was the trauma through which they went. And then comes the idea of what can be done. Listen, if I knew the answer, probably. But I do believe one thing probably the Western policymakers should take very seriously. I don't believe in a world in which double standards does not exist. I don't know any type of a political system in which you can be as consistent, and we know it from our own life. And when it comes to hypocrisy and others, there is a beautiful text by a very well-known American philosopher, Judith Sklar. She was a German emigre. She left during Hitler period. She went to Harvard. She wrote a book which if you have time, I'm strongly recommending. This is one of the books that is not going to help you for any of your courses, but this is a book which is really worth reading. It's called Ordinary Vices. And basically, she believes that the major vice, basically the major evil, is cruelty. But then she talks in a very sophisticated way about hypocrisy. And she said, liberal society assumes hypocrisy. Hypocrisy also has certain positive function. Imagine that anytime you're going to tell me how do you feel, I'm going to tell you the truth. Or what I think about this way or that way. No, hypocrisy is also a type of civility. But the most important story is not only what you are doing, but how you are justifying your policies. The worst is not that our governments from time to time are acting on the base of a realpolitik. The problem is that some of these realpolitik actions are justified on a very high moral ground. Listen, I can imagine good arguments why the American government should be in a coalition with Saudi Arabia. I do believe that it's very difficult to keep people kind of not being morally appalled if this is going to be justified as defense of freedom. And this is the problem of policy being not only what you are doing, but also how you are justifying your policies. I do believe this is critically important because it is this gap that is very much at the heart of the crisis that we see. I'm from the Balkans, and I was quite involved with the Balkan crisis. Listen, from the point of view of the ground, keeping Kosovo as part of Serbia simply was not an option. This is the reality. The basic problem is that it's very difficult to say, we're making an exception, there is a principle, and you should not pay road to this exception, because then comes the major Russian argument, and this is what it means to be a great power. People now try to claim that the Russians want to go back to the 19th century and so on. I don't believe even this, because the major definition of a great power, from the Russian point of view today, is great power is a power that can break the rules with immunity. So if you can break the rules with immunity, the nature of the rules doesn't matter. Russia can function in a liberal system if you're going basically to allow them that they can break the rules anytime when it's important for them. Ukraine, for example. And this is what, in my view, is so important in this crisis, that we are trying to conceptualize an alternative why you have this type of a behavior, but this type of a behavior is very much justified on the attack of hypocrisy and based on the reality of the fact that we ourselves are justifying certain policies, not with the arguments and the reasons these policies have been taken.
Good. Here.
Добрый вечер. My English not very well. In the historical plan, the collapse of Soviet Union opened the chaos, the war, the violence, the intervention in the world. Second question, why Western countries supported the right self-determination of Kosovo and they refused the right self-determination of the Crimean people? Entretemps, Crimea was never belonging to Ukraine. It's second question, why Russian government has supported the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1973, authorizing NATO to bombing against the Libyan people under doctrinal responsibility to protect it? Third question, United Nations international call to cooperation between all the people in the world. What do you understand it? What Western can understand it? The sanction against the Russian people. My last question is Syrian conflict. The Western people, the Western country, power to impose it, the president, the new government, to Syrian people. It is compatible with democracy and the human right. Это я Тупак Амару. Спасибо.
Hello, my name is Dimitrina. I work for a UN specialized agency nearby, but this is a question in private capacity. First of all, thank you for coming. It's such an honor listening to you. My question may go a little bit beyond the scope of what you discussed, but my question is essentially, then what? You're saying that Russia is imitating the West in order to delegitimize the world order. Are you saying they're doing this just out of anarchism, just to destroy an order and then not propose anything else? Because, as you say, they are not here to put another ideology forward? Or are you saying they will transform into a rising power once they've delegitimized the West and maybe put something else forward? Thank you.
Спасибо для вашего вопроса. Let's be very, because there was series of questions. Let's be very quick on this. Soviet Union was a superpower. As a result of it, it knew better than the post-Soviet Russia the limits of sovereignty. Don't forget the following. When you say the collapse of the Soviet Union, you start with the assumptions that the Western powers were very much interested in this. If you go back to history, and we are speaking in a memorial lecture of a historian, you're going to see that in 1990, 1991, if the West was fearing something, it was the collapse of the Soviet Union. Do you know the famous chicken speech of President Bush in Kiev, where he basically went, the old Bush, the Bush senior, who basically went there and said, stay in the Soviet Union. Because now people, when they talk about triumphalism of the West, this is a late 1990s. In 1990, 1991, 1992, the fear was the fear of disintegration and what is going to be basically the result of it. The Yugoslav war scared people a lot. And if you see the books that have been written there, they were not triumphalist books. Brzezinski's book was called Out of Control. So from this point of view, it's not simply that the collapse of the Soviet Union was not the objective of the Western policy, and now especially the Americans, which have been the major part of it. But I'm also going to claim that the reason the Soviet Union started to be interested in the European order in the way it was discussed in the 1990s during the German unification and others was exactly because Mikhail Gorbachev believed that European order is the only way to protect the Soviet Union. That only the idea of a shared sovereignty, a EU type of an environment in which basically classical notion of sovereignty have been revised was the only way for the Soviet Union to survive. But listen, there was a certain political processes which they start, you cannot stop them. And from this point of view, we can basically decide and we can see what was the impact and how certain things have been developed. But to blame the West, that being the purpose of the Western policies in the 1990 and 1991, the disintegration of the Soviet Union, I don't believe it's not true. Something different happened. After disintegration happened, many people in the West started priding themselves for doing this. But this is slightly, we have, by the way, the same problem when it comes to color revolutions and others, when people go on the street, and everybody who knows some of these movements know that they are not so well organized that they look, but when they're over, somebody can say, we did it. And there are very different reasons for saying this. So from this point of view, Kosovo, only one sentence, because Kosovo, Crimea is a very important question. But if the Russian government has decided to go to the UN, to insist on the referendum, to talk about a fair referendum in Crimea, I do believe that they were going to be in a very strong position. And as I told you, I don't know how the Crimean population was going to vote, and I can easily agree that probably the majority of them have decided to vote for independence. But this is not what happened, and it was not simply independence. Neither the European Union, nor the United States, not even Bulgaria decided to annex Kosovo. it was about independence. In this case, you have a classical story of annexation, which is slightly different. One of the great powers takes a piece of land which basically belongs to another. Then you ask, in my view, a very important, for me, spoiler is a very under-researched and under-conceptualized figure in the international relations. Because the spoiler does not make sense in terms of a classical realpolitik, because basically the realists are going to say that, of course, fear of anarchy is what's doing it. Liberal internationalists are going to see very much spoiler as somebody who fails to make an impact and basically trying to do this and that. I do believe that there is a rationale, and the major rationale is that Russia believes that the current international system is too much dominated and biased for the West, and that this is the major threat to the Russia's interest. On the other side, Russia is not strong enough, because you see military power here and there, but on the other side you should look at the Russian economy, and we're not talking about simply sanctions or 3% or 4% decline. We're talking about the structure of the economy. Compared even with the Soviet time, you're going to see that the Russian economy much more resembles the classical third world economy, where a huge percent of the budget comes from selling natural resources. This is very different, for example, than the rise of China, very much based on modernization, industrialization. So from this point of view, I'm not going to call Russia a classical rising power, but Russia captured something, in my view, very important. And this is the fact that all this period of transition and change for the last 25 years brought globally demand for stability. You can see it on the level of governments, you can see it on the level of the public. I was recently listening to one of the Obama special advisor on Middle East, and he made the following statement. He said, listen, in Iraq, you intervened, we occupied, it didn't work. In Libya, we intervened, we didn't occupy, it didn't work. In Syria, we didn't intervene, we didn't occupy, it didn't work. So the very fact that basically you have the feeling of the limits of what you can do. By the way, this is also an easy position and could be a very cynical one. Because we always start with the fact that, for example, if we have not intervened in Libya, it was going to be better by definition. We don't know how it was going to be. In the way we don't know was it going to be better if there was intervention in Syria in 2012. But because of this feeling, I do believe that without having a clear ideology or having a kind of idea of a new architecture, the Russian government managed to capture some of this anxiety and discontent of governments and people around the world. I'm not going to call this ideology, but I do believe that, of course, it makes them much more legitimate in their action, and kind of this is why admired by certain different players, including in our societies, than normally you expect them to be. So this is probably my attempt to answer you.
Спасибо, thank you, Ivan, and it was very, very interesting to listen to you. My name is Maria Hadinskaya, and I'm a Russian scholar. I would first of all agree full on what you said about Yugoslavia and how we felt and our experience. Second, I would also agree with what you said about demand of stability that is growing on, not only in Russia, but everywhere in the West. I mean, it's not only about rhetoric about Iraq or Libya, but Syria as well. It's our common fault. I would argue at the same time with you that President Putin lied, that there were no special servicemen, or Russian special servicemen in Crimea, because basically he didn't say that before, but then he did admit it in April 2014. You may argue that it was too late, but it happened. He said Russian troops, servicemen were in Crimea before the referendum took place. And now I have a question to you. You said about that you said that Russia actually tries to. One of the concepts is Russia trying to teach a lesson to Europe or West in general, or it tries to imitate the West. But I don't really agree with that. But it's my own opinion. I think President Putin actually acts from a real politics point of view, because otherwise he would have, gone to some faraway country, bombed it under false pretext, and that's it. what he did in Crimea, we can argue here about how good or bad it is from the international law, but what matters from the human rights perspective is the life of a human being. And if you compare Kosovo, Yugoslavia in general, and Crimea, in Crimea we had 2 persons shot by 1 sniper, which was a clear provocation, but the rest of the people were safe. And this is what matters, basically, if you compare different examples. So I think, it's my opinion again, I think President Putin is just a real politics person who acts from a real politics view. So where the Russian interests are under threat, it was with Crimea, it's now in Syria, because 4,000 of post-Soviet jihadis are now there, and they can anytime come back. He acts. When Russia's interests are not affected, he doesn't act. That's my point of view. I would like to ask if you agree. Thanks. Спасибо.
Thank you very much for a very interesting speech. My name is Christian. I'm a student of international relations at the Institute. I'd like to go back to discussing the issues, or internal issues, in Russian politics. You've mentioned that perhaps Putin what he's doing externally to challenge the West by exposing its hypocrisy. But you also said that he is not proposing anything new to this imitation of Western values. And I wonder if this is the case, why do you think that Putin needs people such as Vladislav Surkov, for example, who's perhaps known for being the former deputy head of the Russian presidential administration, now a personal advisor to Putin for Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. This selection of countries is obviously no coincidence. Who openly talks about the need of providing Russians an alternative reality, an alternative understanding of politics, who's taken Boris Berezovsky's propaganda techniques in the 1990s to new levels, who's perhaps one of the leaders of or the founders of the Nazi movement and various extremist political movements in Russia, who's proposing things such as Eurasianism or this concept of sovereign democracy, which is to say that there's a particular kind of democracy in Russia, or that applies to Russia, which is perhaps Western-inspired, but Russian culture-based or Russian-inspired. So I wonder if you think that any of these internal movements in Russia, both theoretically but also practically, have any kind of influence in this sense. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. And basically, there were 2 very important questions, because basically they come from the 2 different kind of a very strong interpretation of Russian policy. One is that President Putin and Russia, President acts as a classical realist. He basically defends interests, and he's doing this in the way he see basically being done. Then comes the question, why in 2004, when the Russian interests, national interests, were not so different, and when basically the Orange Revolution was underway, there was no attempt on the side of the Russian government to go to Crimea. I am not one of those who believe that for sure fleet and the fact that you have the very strong part of the population identifying with Russia was very much an argument probably of the decision being taken, but at least my reading of the decision on Crimea was based on something different, and now there was quite a lot of information coming on this. In the beginning it was much more difficult to read. First, the decision was taken very quickly. It was taken by a very small group of people. And nevertheless, the people now try to say there was a military planning. Listen, military, they have a planning for everything. Probably they have a planning also how to take control of the graduate school, but it does not mean that they're planning to do it. This is what military do. Basically, this is what they work. So from this point of view, to tell me somebody, but the Russians used to have a military plan for Crimea, for sure. They have it from 19th century. But it does not mean that this is where they have been going. I do believe the decision was much more done because of the fact that President Putin was totally shocked after Yanukovych lost of power. It was very much covering failure. It was not the reaction of a classical realpolitik. It was much more the fact that you have Russia. By the way, at this moment, the support for President Putin was around 60%, which from his point of view was low. From any other European point of view, was going to be very high. But then basically he feared something very concrete, that this type on the streets are not going to be so much the liberals, but the Russian nationalists. He's going to be basically the man who lost Ukraine. And I do believe that it was much more this type of a reasoning that basically pushed him to do this, because we also talking for very high risk policy. If he simply has made out of Crimea frozen conflict, which means Russia keeping control over Crimea but not going for annexation, the reaction of the West was going to be very different. We have this precedent being done in other places. Remember the Russia-Georgia war. Basically, Russia could have gone to Tbilisi. They didn't do it. Now this was a different logic, and this is why I don't believe that the realpolitik here is enough to explain this. Syria, also I do believe, of course, there is a very much a realpolitik and there is a jihadism, but to be absolutely honest, I do believe that the basic explanation for this also a high-risk decision. Everybody going to Syria these days is taking high risk, not only the Russians, was that during this crisis, the Russian government realized how vulnerable they are to the prices of oil. I have been talking to a number of Russian officials. All of them are totally convinced that the collapse of the oil prices has nothing to do with the market and has everything to do with the American policy and the Saudis. So from this point of view, going to Syria was basically, paradoxically, the way to engage with the Saudis. Because you're going to see in a month that the Russian-Saudi negotiations are going to be critical for the stabilization of Syria, but this is very much having the Russian to influence the prices of oil, which they believe that they are totally political, because they see these prices as very important for the very economic survival of the system. So from this point of view, yes, it is a realpolitik in a way, but also there were other things, for example, and then I go to the ideology. Mr. Surkov, I spent a lot of time on sovereign democracy story. I have been writing about this, I was taking it much more seriously, but at the end of the day, the sovereign democracy appeared and disappeared. There was Surkov, there was sovereign democracy. Came Volodin, there is no sovereign democracy. The problem with the system is that the Russian government is very easily adopting one position or another position, very much opportunistically, how you can affect others. But for example, even if you see Russia as a major conservative power, if you listen basically, family values and so on, they sound like an American evangelical. But basically, if you go and see what is the social reality, you're going to see that the number of divorces in Russia is 3 times average for this same decadent European Union that they try to save. The level of abortions in Russia is very high. So from this point of view, this is not this conservative society. You can speak like a Saudi. This does not make you a Saudi. So from this point of view, the social practices are very different. And from this point of view, it's not by accident that people that have been, and I'm going to finish on this, because as you know, Russian propaganda was one of the major discussion of the last 2 years. There was a colleague of ours, Peter Marantsev, who wrote a book about it, and his major idea was that now the Russian propaganda is more effective than in the Soviet times, because in the Soviet times they believed in something, so certain things were impossible for them. But now they can attack from the left, from the right. It's true, but at the same time I was reading the latest opinion poll about the image of President Putin and Russia in 4 different countries in the world. It was done by Pew Research in the late May. And this is my question. Do you know which is the European country in which is the most negative, not to Russia, but to President Putin? Public opinion in which of the European country is 90% negative on President Putin? I'm asking this because for me, I was never going to guess so, but but as you know, Odin said, guessing is always more fun than knowing. So, so this country is Spain, out of all countries. And do you know why? Because when you see basically the figures, you try to understand what is behind the figures. Spain is a very Russia-friendly country. There is a history of this. Spain was not active at all during the Ukrainian crisis. But for 3 very specific reasons, public opinion in Spain developed a very strong negativism, or at least declared in the poll, towards the President Putin. First, Spanish left is very much coming from, it's a cultural left. It's about social gay rights and others. For them, the gay rights is very important for the very identity of the Spanish left. So for them, President Putin is the guy who started war on gays. They don't like him. Spanish right is very much coming from 2 traditions. One is the Cold War tradition, and for them, basically, Putin's Russia is the paperback edition of the Soviet Union, so they don't like it very much. But on the other, they're very sensitive on the problem of secession because of Catalonia, and they don't like Crimea story. But thirdly, what is much more important, and which was also news for me, it appeared that a lot of Spanish families have adopted Russian orphans in the last 15 years. So for them, Dima Yakovlev law, which basically was forbidding the foreigners to adopt Russian orphans, was perceived as very cruel. This was very much in the media, it was a human interest and so on. I'm not saying that in 1 year it's going to be like this, but the fact that you can attack from the left and from the right also means that basically you can end up without your own constituency. The Soviet propaganda was much more constrained, but they have the constituencies, the communist parties in these countries and so on, people on whom you can rely. Here you have a lot of sympathizers, but not much more hardcore supporters. So probably I should stop here.
Well, we are delighted that you accepted to give us the 2015 Pierre Dubois lecture, and you understand why we are so pleased to have Ivan Krastev back at the Graduate Institute. Deep knowledge, full of subtlety, and a bit of haute voltige in Russian. And so we very much look forward to welcome you once again here. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much.